My parents called me uneducated trash and threw my luggage onto the driveway. "Get out, you lowlife," my father yelled in front of our entire family. They thought they were kicking out a college dropout with zero prospects. They had absolutely no idea that the daughter they were discarding had just sold a tech company for $36 million. So I looked at them, smiled, and said, "Okay, fine." I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply walked away. What they did not know was that walking away was step one of my plan to legally seize every single thing they owned. Let me tell you exactly how I took out the trash. The crystal chandelier cast a harsh, warm glow over the dining room of my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate, but the atmosphere was absolutely freezing. We were supposed to be celebrating the 30th anniversary of my father Desmond's transport company. It was meant to be a night of family unity and pride. Instead, I was the main course for their cruelty. My father stood up suddenly, his heavy oak chair scraping violently against the expensive hardwood floor. His face was contorted with a rage that had been brewing since the moment I walked through the front door. He marched over to the entryway, grabbed the faded canvas duffel bag I had brought for the weekend, and hurled it directly out the open double doors onto the driveway. The heavy thud echoed through the silent foyer, bouncing off the marble walls. "Get out, you lowlife!" My father bellowed, his voice carrying that booming, authoritative tone he usually reserved for his Sunday sermons at the megachurch. "I will not have uneducated trash polluting this family celebration. You have been nothing but a massive stain on this family legacy since the day you selfishly dropped out of law school." I stood near the edge of the dining table, gripping the leather strap of my purse. I did not flinch. 5 years ago, I had left my prestigious law program to build a logistics software platform from the ground up. To my traditional, highly image-conscious family, stepping off the established path of becoming a lawyer meant I was an absolute failure. They never bothered to ask what happened to my software development. If they had taken even 5 minutes to care, they would know my platform was just acquired for $36 million. But I kept my mouth completely shut as my golden boy brother Jamal chuckled from his comfortable seat at the head of the table. Jamal had nearly bankrupted my father's transport company twice in the last 3 years with his terrible management skills. Yet he wore a perfectly tailored custom suit and played the part of the flawless, successful son. Beside him, his wife Chelsea swirled her expensive red wine with an air of absolute superiority. Chelsea came from old wealth, and she absolutely loved weaponizing her status and her race against me at every single opportunity. She leaned back in her chair and gave me a deeply condescending smile. "Please do not get all ghetto on us, Nyla." Chelsea said, her tone dripping with fake polite concern. "You are literally bringing down the property value just by standing there in those cheap clothes. Jamal and his father have worked way too hard to build a respectable image in this community for you to ruin it with your hustle culture street behavior. Maybe you should try enrolling in a local community college." The blatant microaggression hung heavy in the dining room air, but absolutely no one corrected her. Instead, my mother Vivica smoothed the fabric of her designer evening gown and stepped forward. My mother was completely obsessed with how our family appeared to her high society church friends and the local elite. "Chelsea is exactly right," my mother said, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "You are a complete embarrassment, Nyla. I spend half my time at the country club making up elaborate lies about where you are and what you do for a living. Do not ever show your face at our church again. I cannot have the congregation knowing my own daughter is a struggling dropout while Jamal is out here securing million-dollar business deals and carrying the family name." I looked slowly at the three of them, taking in the entire scene. My father was red-faced and furiously pointing toward the door. My mother was far more concerned with her delicate social standing than her own flesh and blood. And my older brother sat there with his smug, entitled wife pretending they were the absolute peak of success and excellence. They honestly believed I was broke, desperate, and crawling back for a handout. They believed they held all the financial and emotional power in this room. "Okay, fine," I said. My voice was completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. I did not raise my tone. I did not shed a single tear. I just looked my father dead in the eye and gave him a polite, dismissive smile. "Thank you for the dinner. I turned on my heel and walked out the grand front doors, stepping right past my discarded duffel bag on the illuminated driveway. I did not even bother picking it up. I left it sitting there on the pristine pavement, as a symbol of the helpless girl they thought I still was. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, with a resounding crack locking me out of the family forever. But as soon as I rounded the corner of the gated community, away from their prying eyes, my entire posture shifted. The polite, submissive daughter vanished instantly. Waiting for me under the dim glow of a street lamp was a sleek black bulletproof Maybach. My private driver stepped out immediately and opened the heavy rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat, the quiet luxury of the vehicle enveloping me. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed the private direct number of Elijah. He was not just my lead corporate attorney. He was the most ruthless financial fixer in Atlanta and the executive director of my private investment fund, Obsidian Capital. He answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and professional. "Are we doing this, Nyla?" I stared out the tinted window as the Maybach glided smoothly past the wrought iron gates of my parents' neighborhood one last time. The anger I had held back in that dining room now fueled my next move. "Initiate the hostile takeover," I told him, my voice as cold and sharp as ice. "Buy up every single piece of toxic debt my father and Jamal have accumulated over the years. I want the transport company. I want the estate. I want absolutely everything." "Consider it done," Elijah replied without a moment of hesitation. They thought they were kicking out a failure. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire kingdom directly to their absolute worst nightmare. The engine of the Maybach purred quietly as we merged onto the highway, leaving the toxic pretending behind. I opened my laptop in the back seat, bringing up the financial dossiers Elijah had prepared weeks in advance. My family loved to brag about their legacy and their wealth, but the spreadsheets on my screen told the real story. They were drowning in secret loans and fraudulent mortgages, and I now possessed the capital to buy the very air they breathed. Tomorrow morning, the real game would begin, and they would never see the total destruction coming. Exactly 1 week passed since the night my father threw my bag onto the driveway and declared me an uneducated failure. I did not spend a single minute of those 7 days mourning the loss of a family that never truly wanted me. Instead, I watched them blindly dig their own graves. The majestic glass walls of my father's logistics company hid a rotting core. My brother Jamal was sitting in the corner office that he had not earned, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. The computer screen in front of him displayed a sea of red numbers. The company operating accounts were practically empty. He had been quietly siphoning funds for months to prop up the failing vanity fashion brand owned by his wife Chelsea. The office door swung open and Chelsea marched in without knocking. She slammed her designer handbag onto his desk, complaining that her suppliers were threatening to halt production. She demanded another wire transfer immediately. Jamal rubbed his temples and told her there was nothing left to transfer. He confessed that he had already drained the emergency reserves, and if our father found out, they would both be ruined. Chelsea did not offer an ounce of sympathy. Instead, she weaponized her usual tactics. Her eyes welled with perfectly timed tears as she accused Jamal of not providing for her the way a real man should. She reminded him that she married into a wealthy legacy, and if he could not fund her lifestyle, she would find someone who could. She told him to figure it out and use the family name to secure a loan. Then she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving him completely desperate. Jamal knew he could never go to a traditional bank. A real bank would require a full audit and my father's direct authorization. The embezzlement would be discovered instantly. He needed quiet money. He needed a shadow lender who did not ask too many questions. Through his desperate networking at the local country club, he caught wind of a highly exclusive private credit fund known for issuing massive loans with extreme discretion. Obsidian Capital. He immediately requested a meeting, completely unaware that he was walking directly into my web. I sat in my downtown penthouse, sipping a cup of dark coffee while watching the live security feed from the Obsidian Capital boardroom. My lead attorney and executive director Elijah was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table. Elijah was a master of his craft, sharp, relentless, and entirely loyal to me. Jamal was ushered into the room looking frantic, but trying desperately to project the image of a wealthy logistics heir. He puffed out his chest and immediately started name-dropping our father and boasting about the family legacy. He threw around inflated revenue projections and promised that the loan was just a temporary bridge for a minor expansion. Elijah let him talk without changing his expression. When Jamal finally ran out of breath, Elijah slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished table. $5 million. The exact amount Jamal had requested. Jamal reached for the pen, but Elijah placed a firm hand over the paperwork. He stated the terms clearly and coldly. Obsidian Capital required absolute security for a loan of this magnitude. They would not accept the logistics company fleet or the warehouses as collateral because the industry was too volatile. Elijah demanded something permanent. He demanded the family mansion and the prime real estate sitting directly underneath my father's honorary church. Jamal froze. The color completely drained from his face. He knew that putting the family estate and the church land up as collateral was a massive betrayal. If he defaulted, he would leave our parents homeless and destroy the sanctuary our mother worshipped in. He started to stammer, trying to negotiate for different terms. Elijah simply pulled the documents back toward himself. He told Jamal the offer was non-negotiable and would expire the moment he walked out of the room. He reminded Jamal that shadow funds do not wait for permission. Right at that moment, Jamal's phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Chelsea threatening to humiliate him in front of their entire social circle if her boutique accounts were not funded by the end of the day. The pressure of maintaining his golden boy image completely shattered whatever tiny shred of loyalty he had left for our parents. Jamal grabbed the pen. He did not read the fine print. He did not ask for a lawyer to review the terms. He signed his own name rapidly on the first line. Then his hand hovered over the second line, which required the signature of the primary property owner. With shaking fingers, my brother forged our father's signature perfectly onto the dotted line. In a matter of seconds, he legally signed away the very roof over our parents' heads and the sacred ground they prayed on. Elijah calmly collected the paperwork and checked the signatures. He gave Jamal a tight, professional smile and informed him that the $5 million would be wired to his account within the hour. Jamal let out a massive sigh of relief. He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and walked out of the boardroom feeling like an absolute genius who had just saved his own skin. He had absolutely no idea that the trap had just snapped shut around his ankles. In my penthouse, my secure phone lit up with an incoming call. I answered it immediately. Elijah's calm voice came through the speaker. He confirmed that we had the signatures and the collateral was officially ours. I smiled and closed my laptop. The silent takeover had begun and my family was holding the shovel to their own grave. My mother Vivica was a woman who practically breathed status. To her, the appearance of wealth was far more important than actual oxygen. She built her entire identity around being the flawless matriarch of a prominent Atlanta family. But appearances cost money, and the secret financial hemorrhage caused by Jamal and Chelsea was finally trickling down to her daily allowances. Her platinum credit cards were suddenly being declined at her favorite high-end boutiques. She had tried to purchase a custom gown for an upcoming gala, only to have the terminal reject her transaction 3 times. Desmond had told her there was just a minor clerical error at the bank, but my mother was not completely stupid when it came to preserving her own skin. She knew the family cash flow was drying up. She had seen the panicked look in my father's eyes late at night. She just refused to admit it out loud. Instead of confronting my father, she decided to take matters into her own perfectly manicured hands. She needed liquid cash to maintain her weekly country club lunches and her massive charity donations. She could never let the other wealthy wives suspect that the prestigious transport family was struggling to pay for basic luxuries. The gossip alone would destroy her. So she quietly packed up the most prized possession she owned, the vintage diamond heirloom necklace and matching chandelier earrings that had been in our family for 4 generations. The pieces were a symbol of our lineage, and she used to parade them around as undeniable proof of our elite status. My mother slipped out of the mansion on a Tuesday morning, wearing an oversized designer hat and dark sunglasses to hide her face. She drove her Mercedes directly to the most exclusive private jeweler in the wealthy district of Buckhead. This was not a standard pawn shop on a street corner. This was a discreet, highly secure vault where old money families went to quietly liquidate their assets without making the evening news. The establishment only dealt with high net worth individuals who needed temporary discretion. She walked into the pristine marble lobby expecting ultimate privacy. She demanded to see the head appraiser, immediately refusing to speak to the junior staff. She placed the velvet box on the glass counter and began explaining that she simply wanted to temporarily loan the pieces to the vault for safekeeping while they traveled. It was a thinly veiled lie to cover up the fact that she was pawning her family legacy just to keep up a fake rich lifestyle. She spoke with her usual arrogant tone, demanding preferential treatment and a premium valuation based entirely on her family name. The appraiser respectfully took the pieces into the back room for proper valuation. My mother stood near the display cases, trying to look incredibly bored and unbothered. She was completely unaware that I had a scheduled private viewing at that exact same jeweler. I was looking for a specific vintage timepiece to purchase as a gift for Elijah to celebrate the successful closing of the shadow loan. I had been sitting in the VIP suite, sipping sparkling water, while the staff showed me their most exclusive inventory. I stepped out of the private viewing room wearing a tailored white silk suit that cost more than her entire seasonal wardrobe. I paused when I saw her standing by the main counter. We made eye contact, and the temperature in the elegant showroom dropped below freezing. My mother lowered her sunglasses slowly. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her usual mask of superiority snapped right back into place. She looked me up and down, taking in my pristine suit, but her mind refused to accept the reality of what she was seeing. To her, I was still the uneducated failure she had kicked out a week ago. She assumed my outfit was either stolen or rented. "Nyla," she said, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet store. "What on earth are you doing in a place like this? Did you finally take my advice and look for a janitorial job? Because if you are here to clean the display cases, you are severely underdressed." I did not react to her venom. I had spent my entire life absorbing her insults and letting them break my spirit. But the woman standing before her now was bulletproof. I simply walked gracefully toward the counter, standing right next to her. I noticed the empty velvet box resting near her designer handbag. I knew exactly what she was doing. I had spent years analyzing the financial patterns of this family, and I knew they were running out of liquid cash faster than a sinking ship taking on water. "I am not here to clean. Mother," I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured. "I am just running a few errands. It is surprising to see you here, though. I thought you never let the family heirlooms out of your sight. I remember you telling me those diamonds were the physical manifestation of our family pride." She stiffened, her posture becoming extremely rigid. She glared at me with absolute disgust. "That is none of your business," she hissed under her breath, looking around to make sure none of the wealthy clients were listening. "You are a disgrace to this family. You should not even be standing near me. Go back to whatever struggling life you are trying to build, and leave me alone before you ruin my reputation any further." At that exact moment, the head appraiser walked back out from the secure vault. He carried the tray holding my mother's magnificent diamond necklace and earrings. The stones caught the showroom light, glittering brightly against the dark velvet. He cleared his throat apologetically and looked at my mother. He told her that given the current market conditions, the absolute maximum loan they could offer for the set was $200,000. My mother looked like she had just been physically struck. She argued that the pieces were worth at least $500,000. She demanded that he reconsider and reminded him of her social standing and her husband's business empire. The appraiser remained strictly professional, stating that $200,000 was their final offer for a collateral pawn, and they could not extend the limit simply based on a family name. She was desperate. She needed the money to fund the massive charity gala she was hosting this weekend. If she canceled the gala, The rumors of their financial ruin would spread through Atlanta like wildfire. She took a deep breath and reached for the pen to sign the humiliating pawn agreement. She was literally selling our family history to buy fake smiles from people who did not even care about her. I stepped forward before the pen could touch the paper. I looked directly at the appraiser. "I will buy the set outright," I said, my voice cutting clearly through the quiet room. "I will pay the full $500,000 valuation in cash right now." My mother froze, completely paralyzed. She turned her head slowly to look at me, as if I had just grown a second head. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded desperate. "You do not have $500, let alone $500,000, she sneered. "Stop embarrassing yourself and get out of here before I have security throw you out. You are making a fool of yourself, Nyla." I did not say a single word. I simply opened my small clutch and pulled out my solid black American Express Centurion card. I placed it gently onto the glass counter right next to her trembling hand. The heavy metal card made a soft clinking sound that seemed to echo like thunder. The appraiser immediately recognized the invitation-only card. His entire demeanor shifted from polite to deeply respectful. He took the card without hesitation and began processing the massive transaction. My mother stopped breathing. Her eyes were locked onto the black metal card sitting on the terminal. She watched in absolute silence as the machine approved a $500,000 purchase in less than 5 seconds. The appraiser handed me the receipt to sign and carefully placed the diamond heirlooms into a secure travel case. He handed the elegant bag to me and bowed his head slightly, thanking me for my business. My mother was completely paralyzed. The arrogant smirk had vanished from her face, leaving behind a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Her hands shook as she stared at the woman she had called uneducated trash just days ago. She could not comprehend how the daughter she had thrown out onto the driveway was now effortlessly dropping $500,000 on a random Tuesday morning without blinking an eye. Her reality was fracturing in real time. I picked up the secure bag containing the diamonds and turned to face her. I gave her the exact same condescending smile she had given me my entire life. "Thanks for holding on to my stuff, Mom," I said, my voice soft but deadly. I walked out of the jeweler, leaving her standing there entirely frozen as the heavy glass doors closed behind me. The sun beat down on the manicured lawns of the Piedmont Driving Club, where Chelsea was holding her monthly afternoon tea party. She had rented out the most exclusive private terrace overlooking the 18th hole, just for her circle of wealthy friends. These were women who measured a person's worth entirely by their zip code and the designer labels draped across their shoulders. Chelsea thrived in this superficial environment. She absolutely loved being the center of attention and spending the entire afternoon spinning elaborate fictions about her struggling fashion brand as if it were the next global empire. Silver-tiered trays loaded with imported caviar, delicate French pastries, and rare artisan teas covered the long white table. Bottles of vintage champagne were being popped open by the attentive staff every 15 minutes to keep the crystal flutes completely full. Chelsea laughed loudly, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder while she bragged to her friends about a fabricated upcoming trip to Paris. She claimed she was flying out to secure new textile manufacturers for her growing boutique. She painted a flawless picture of absolute financial dominance, completely ignoring the bitter reality that her husband had just secretly mortgaged his parents' entire estate to keep her vanity project afloat. The afternoon dragged on in a blur of hollow compliments and subtle boasting. Chelsea soaked up the endless validation like a sponge desperate to prove she belonged among the Southern elite. She signaled the head waiter with a dismissive flick of her wrist, ready to wrap up the extravagant display of wealth. The waiter approached quietly and placed the black leather-bound checkbook gently on the table. The total came out to just over $10,000 for a few hours of finger sandwiches and champagne. Chelsea did not even bother looking at the itemized receipt. She smoothly pulled the heavy metal corporate card belonging to my father's logistics company from her purse and tossed it carelessly onto the silver tray. She went right back to telling a long-winded story about her upcoming summer plans, waving her hand as the waiter walked away to process the payment. In her mind, the logistics company was a bottomless piggy bank existing solely to fund her extravagant lifestyle and impress her shallow social circle. She expected the waiter to return quickly with a mint and a polite smile thanking her for her generous patronage. Instead, the waiter returned 5 minutes later, looking incredibly nervous. He stood slightly behind her chair, holding the leather checkbook tightly against his chest. He leaned down and whispered softly, trying to preserve her dignity in front of her high society guests. He politely informed her that the terminal had rejected the transaction and asked if she perhaps had another form of payment. Chelsea stopped talking mid-sentence. The polite fake smile vanished from her face and was instantly replaced by a deep, indignant scowl. She looked at the waiter as if he had just tracked mud across a pristine white carpet. She raised her voice intentionally, making sure all her friends could hear the exchange. She told him his machine must be broken because she was handing him a corporate account with a limitless balance. She snatched her purse and pulled out a second card tied to a different business account and threw it onto the tray, telling him to try again and to stop wasting her valuable time. The waiter rushed away, his face bright red with embarrassment, while Chelsea's friends murmured supportive comments about the utter incompetence of service workers these days. Chelsea took a long sip of her champagne, shaking her head in exaggerated disbelief. But less than 3 minutes later, the club manager approached the table personally. His face was completely pale and his posture was stiff. He did not bother whispering this time. He placed both metal cards on the table and stated clearly that every single card tied to her name and her husband's corporate accounts had been completely declined by the issuer. He requested that she provide a personal credit card or wire the funds directly to settle the $10,000 bill immediately. The entire table fell dead silent. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. Chelsea's friends stared at her, their eyes wide with shock and quiet judgment. The absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to a woman in her fragile social position was happening right now. It was public financial humiliation. Chelsea completely lost her mind. The perfectly poised country club wife vanished, and a vicious, entitled monster took her place. She stood up aggressively, knocking her heavy chair backward against the stone patio. She began screaming at the manager, demanding his full name and threatening to have him fired before sunset. She yelled that she was a member of one of the most powerful families in Atlanta, and they were treating her like a common criminal over a miserable $10,000 tab. She snatched her phone from the table and declared she was calling her elite banking concierge right this second to prove how utterly incompetent the club staff were. She put the phone on speaker volume turned all the way up and slammed it onto the center of the table so her friends and the manager could hear her incoming vindication. The phone rang twice before the private bank manager answered. Chelsea did not even bother saying hello. She launched into a furious tirade demanding to know why her corporate cards were being declined at a prestigious country club. She screamed about a major glitch in their system and demanded they authorize the charge immediately to save her from further embarrassment. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The bank manager cleared his throat, sounding genuinely terrified. He told Chelsea there was no glitch. He explained that less than an hour ago, a massive legal directive had come through from a superior financial institution. Every single account tied to her husband and the entire logistics company had been completely frozen. There was zero liquidity available anywhere. The assets were locked down tight under a hostile debt acquisition order. Chelsea stared at the phone, her face draining of all color. Her friends were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting away as the heavy stench of bankruptcy filled the crisp patio air. Chelsea grabbed the phone, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of fear and pure rage. She demanded to know who had the power to freeze a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. She yelled that it was completely illegal for anyone to touch her husband's accounts without proper warning. She ordered the bank manager to give her the name of the new lien holder who dared to authorize such a massive asset freeze. The speakerphone crackled slightly in the quiet breeze of the patio. The bank manager typed something on his keyboard before reading the legal documentation out loud. He stated that the debt had been fully acquired by Obsidian Capital, and the immediate asset freeze was executed manually by the sole owner of the fund. Chelsea screamed at him to read the name on the signature line. The manager took a breath and read the name slowly and clearly. He told her the authorizing signature reads, Nyla. The phone slipped out of Chelsea's hand and crashed onto the table. Her knees buckled slightly as the realization hit her like a freight train. The uneducated trash they had thrown out of the house was now holding the leash to their entire existence. The weekend arrived, bringing with it the most anticipated high society event of the year. The Atlanta Heritage Charity Gala was the absolute peak of the social calendar. It was a room filled with old money politicians and venture capitalists looking for their next big acquisition. My father, Desmond, had been banking on this exact night for months. He was desperate to court new investors and secure a massive cash injection to save his sinking logistics empire. He stood near the center of the ballroom, wearing a velvet tuxedo, smiling and shaking hands with billionaires. He was completely unaware that his company was already entirely mine. Beside him stood my mother, Vivica. She was dripping in what appeared to be her famous family diamonds. Only she and I knew they were flawless cubic zirconia replicas she had rush-ordered after I bought the real heirlooms out from under her. She smiled tightly at the cameras, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. And then there was Chelsea. My sister-in-law looked absolutely sick. She was wearing a designer dress, but her face was pale, and her hands shook as she gripped a glass of dark red wine. She had spent the last 3 days living in pure terror after discovering that I was the phantom debt holder who had frozen all her corporate credit cards. She had not told Jamal the truth yet. She was too cowardly to admit that she had pushed him into signing away his parents' home to the very sister they had discarded. Instead, she drank heavily, trying to numb the reality that her fake rich lifestyle was effectively over. The grand double doors of the ballroom opened and the low hum of classical music was entirely drowned out by the sudden wave of intense whispers. I stepped into the light. I did not arrive in cheap clothes or a faded duffel bag. I arrived wearing a breathtaking custom emerald green haute couture gown that swept the floor with layers of heavy silk. A delicate diamond choker rested on my collarbone, complementing the absolute confidence radiating from my posture. My security detail waited discreetly in the hall while I walked down the grand staircase. Every single camera flashed. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My family stared in utter disbelief. My father's polite smile instantly morphed into a mask of pure rage. He could not comprehend how the daughter he had publicly banished was walking into a $50,000-a-plate charity dinner looking like absolute royalty. Chelsea watched me glide across the room and something inside her completely snapped. The humiliation of her declined credit cards and the sheer terror of my financial power boiled over into irrational venom. She could not accept that I was the one holding the keys to her future. She needed to tear me down and put me back in my place. She needed to publicly humiliate me to regain some twisted sense of control over her crumbling life. Chelsea marched toward me holding her crystal glass of red wine tightly. As she closed the distance, she feigned a sudden stumble. She lunged forward intentionally, thrusting her arm out and splashing the dark red vintage wine directly onto the bodice of my emerald silk gown. The dark liquid splattered across the expensive fabric, leaving a massive, ugly stain right down the front of my dress. Several guests gasped, covering their mouths in shock. Chelsea immediately threw herself backward, pretending to lose her balance. She let out a loud, theatrical cry, putting her hands up defensively. "Oh my goodness, I slipped," she wailed, making sure her voice carried to the surrounding tables. "Please do not be so aggressive, Nyla. I know you are angry that you do not belong here, but there is no need to push me." She played the fragile victim perfectly. My mother rushed over immediately, placing a protective arm around Chelsea and glaring at me with absolute disgust. Vivica raised her chin and loudly declared that my presence was an insult to the charity and that I was nothing but a violent brute who could not handle civilized society. They waited for me to break. They expected me to cry or scream or run out of the ballroom in shame, just like the helpless girl I used to be. I looked down at the dark wine soaking into my dress. I did not flinch. I did not reach for a napkin. I simply looked back up at Chelsea and gave her a slow, chilling smile. At that exact moment, the ballroom lights dimmed, and the spotlight illuminated the main stage. The chairman of the charity organization stepped up to the podium and tapped the microphone. The room quieted down as he began his speech. He announced that tonight they had reached a historic milestone for the Children's Hospital. He told the crowd that a single anonymous donor had fully funded the new pediatric wing with an unprecedented cash gift of $10 million. My father puffed out his chest, preparing to network with whoever this mysterious billionaire might be. He leaned forward, whispering to Jamal that they needed to corner the donor before the night was over to pitch their logistics company. The chairman smiled warmly. He announced that the anonymous donor had graciously agreed to say a few words to the guests tonight. He gestured toward the center of the room and called my name. He asked Nyla, the executive director of Obsidian Capital, to please come to the stage. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute. It was deafening. My father stopped breathing. Jamal's jaw dropped so hard it nearly unhinged. Vivica stumbled backward as if the floor had given way beneath her feet. Chelsea let out a small, pathetic gasp, her eyes darting frantically for an exit. I stepped away from them, ignoring the dark wine stain completely ruining my gown. I walked toward the stage with the grace of a conquering queen. I climbed the steps and stood behind the podium, looking out over the sea of wealthy elites. My gaze landed directly on my family, standing frozen in the middle of the room. I adjusted the microphone and let my voice fill the massive ballroom. I thanked the chairman and spoke briefly about the importance of legacy and building a future based on absolute integrity. I said that true wealth is not defined by stolen assets or fraudulent loans. I looked dead into my father's eyes as I spoke. I announced to the entire room of investors that Obsidian Capital had recently acquired the toxic debt of several failing local businesses. I stated clearly and loudly that my fund had just initiated a total hostile takeover of Desmond's logistics company due to gross mismanagement, severe embezzlement, and imminent bankruptcy. The whispers erupted into a chaotic roar. Venture capitalists and bank executives immediately pulled out their phones to cancel any pending deals with my father. I warned the elite crowd not to throw their good money into an empty grave. I effectively completely destroyed my father's business reputation in less than 3 minutes, standing there in my ruined dress. My father clutched his chest, gasping for air as his entire world collapsed around him. Jamal looked like he was going to be sick right there on the expensive carpet. Chelsea tried to hide her face, but there was nowhere left to run. I stood at the podium victorious, having finally taken out the trash. The morning after the charity gala, the logistics company headquarters was a scene of absolute chaos. Employees were packing up their desks and whispering frantically about the massive scandal that had just exploded the night before. The news of the hostile takeover had already hit the local financial blogs. Phones were ringing off the hook, but nobody was answering them. Jamal sat in his glass-enclosed corner office, staring blankly at his blinking phone. The grace period for the $5 million loan was officially over, and the reality of his situation was finally crushing him. He was sweating, completely terrified of facing our father, who was currently sedated at home after his collapse at the dinner. Jamal dialed the direct line to Obsidian Capital for the 20th time that morning, begging the receptionist to patch him through to a decision-maker. He left desperate voicemails promising astronomical interest rates if they would just grant him a 30-day extension to figure things out. He honestly believed he could still talk his way out of this disaster. The heavy glass door to his office pushed open. Jamal jumped out of his leather chair, expecting to see building security coming to escort him out. Instead, Elijah walked in. My lead attorney looked impeccable in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a single slim leather folder under his arm. He did not knock, and he did not offer a polite greeting. He simply walked over to the large mahogany desk and looked at Jamal with a mixture of pity and absolute boredom. Jamal immediately launched into a frantic pitch. He held up his hands and practically begged Elijah to listen to reason. He claimed the charity gala announcement was just a dramatic stunt by a disgruntled family member, and that the logistics empire still had massive value if they could just restructure the debt. He promised to give Obsidian Capital exclusive shipping contracts for the next decade. He begged for just one more month to liquidate some secondary warehouses and find the cash. He swore on his family name that every single cent would be repaid with heavy interest. Elijah stood completely still, letting Jamal exhaust himself. When the room finally went quiet, Elijah spoke, his voice cutting through the desperate air like a scalpel. He informed Jamal that Obsidian Capital was not a charity, and they did not grant extensions to men who forged their father's signatures to secure fraudulent loans. He stated that the default protocols were already in motion and the physical locks on the building would be changed by noon. Before Jamal could fall to his knees, the office door flew open again. Chelsea burst into the room wearing oversized dark sunglasses and clutching her designer handbag. She had rushed over the moment she heard the takeover was actually happening. When she saw Elijah standing there, her entire demeanor shifted. She completely ignored her panicked husband and zeroed in on the man she thought held the power. She assumed Elijah was just another greedy corporate suit who could be easily swayed by a beautiful woman with the right offer. Chelsea walked slowly toward Elijah, letting her sunglasses slide down her nose to reveal her big pleading eyes. She put on a sickly sweet smile and lowered her voice to a soft purr. She told Elijah that there was no need for things to be so incredibly hostile between them. She stepped uncomfortably close to him, leaning over the desk and deliberately brushing her hand against his tailored sleeve. She whispered that if he could just freeze the foreclosure and accidentally lose the paperwork for a few weeks, she would make sure he was personally compensated. She heavily implied that she was willing to offer him a private side deal far away from the prying eyes of his bosses at Obsidian Capital. Elijah looked down at her hand resting on his arm as if it were a dead insect. He took a deliberate step back, completely removing himself from her personal space. The office blinds were wide open and dozens of employees were staring through the glass walls, watching the boss wife throw herself at the man shutting down their company. Elijah raised his voice just enough so the people standing outside the door could hear every single word. He asked Chelsea if she was seriously attempting to offer a physical bribe to a corporate attorney in a glass office while her husband's company went bankrupt. He advised her to keep her hands to herself before he added attempted bribery to the long list of criminal charges currently pending against her family. The remaining staff in the bullpen actually gasped out loud. Chelsea recoiled, her face burning bright red as the sheer humiliation washed over her. She tried to stammer a defense, claiming he completely misunderstood her intentions, but the damage was permanently done. The entire floor had just watched her humiliate herself, trying to flirt her way out of financial ruin. Jamal finally found his voice angrily telling Chelsea to step back and demanding that Elijah show some respect to his wife. He puffed out his chest, trying to play the protective husband one last time. He stated that he was still the operating manager of this facility, and he demanded to know exactly what criminal charges Elijah was talking about. He insisted that the loan was just a standard business transaction that went slightly wrong due to unforeseen market conditions. He claimed he had used every single dollar of that $5 million to try and keep the logistics company afloat during a tough quarter. Elijah did not argue. He simply unclasped the slim leather folder he had brought with him. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and let it flutter down onto the center of the desk, right in front of Jamal and Chelsea. It was not a loan document or a foreclosure notice. It was a highly detailed offshore banking statement. Elijah tapped the paper with his index finger. He coldly explained that Obsidian Capital runs exhaustive financial audits on all defaulted accounts. They do not just look at where the money went locally, they track every single digital footprint across the globe. He pointed to a specific line item highlighted in bright yellow ink. Jamal looked down at the paper and felt the remaining air leave his lungs. The statement showed a direct wire transfer executed less than 2 hours after the $5 million loan hit the logistics company account. It was a transfer for exactly $2 million. The receiving account was not tied to any shipping vendor or warehouse supplier. It was routed directly to a private shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. Elijah looked right into Jamal's terrified eyes. He informed my brother that our forensic accountants knew the Cayman account was directly tied to Chelsea's failing vanity fashion brand. He stated clearly that routing secured corporate loan funds into a hidden offshore personal account was not just poor management or a desperate business maneuver. It was textbook federal fraud. And my sister-in-law was the primary beneficiary. Chelsea stared at the bank statement completely paralyzed. She had thought her offshore account was entirely untraceable. Jamal looked from the paper to his wife, realizing the absolute magnitude of the crime they had committed together. Elijah smiled a cold, calculating smile. He picked up his leather folder and told them they had exactly 30 minutes to clear out their desks before he called the federal authorities. They did not even need 30 minutes. Jamal and Chelsea practically ran out of the glass office, leaving their personal belongings behind in a frantic blur of sheer panic. The drive back to the sprawling family estate was a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Jamal violently hitting the steering wheel. As soon as his expensive car slammed into park in the circular driveway, Jamal stormed through the grand double doors of the mansion. Chelsea was right on his heels, but the terrified wife routine had completely vanished. She walked into the foyer with her arms crossed and a deeply calculated expression on her face. Jamal turned around and cornered her in the center of the massive living room. His voice shook with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. He demanded to know exactly how long the offshore Cayman account had existed. He screamed that she had intentionally manipulated him into securing the shadow loan just so she could siphon $2 million directly into her own personal safety net. He paced back and forth, pulling at his hair, asking how she could possibly betray him when he had just risked federal prison to fund her failing fashion brand. Chelsea did not shed a single tear. She dropped her designer bag onto the pristine white sofa and let out a cold, dismissive laugh. She looked at her husband as if he were nothing more than a pathetic bug on the floor. She told Jamal to stop acting like a victim. She admitted that the offshore account had been active for over a year, and she had been quietly filtering funds out of his logistics company long before I ever initiated the hostile takeover. She called him a weak, incompetent fool who was so desperate to feel like a powerful CEO that he practically handed her the company bank codes on a silver platter. Jamal was hyperventilating. His perfectly tailored world was collapsing into dust. He lunged toward her, demanding that she transfer the $2 million back into the logistics account right this second. He begged her to fix this, saying that if they returned the stolen funds to Obsidian Capital, maybe Elijah would call off the federal fraud investigation. He told her to open her laptop and initiate the wire transfer before the authorities showed up at their front door. Chelsea took a step back and gave him a look of pure, unadulterated venom. She told him that she would not be transferring a single dime. That money was hers. She stated that she had wasted years of her life playing the perfect supportive wife to a man who could not even run a warehouse properly, and the $2 million was her severance package. She informed Jamal that the offshore account was completely untouchable and entirely in her maiden name. He had absolutely zero access to it. Jamal was blinded by fury. He threatened to call the police himself. He yelled that he would tell the authorities everything about her embezzlement and her fake vendors. He promised he would drag her down with him and make sure she spent the best years of her life in a federal penitentiary. Chelsea did not flinch. She leaned in close and smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. She asked him if he really wanted to involve the police. She reminded him in a slow, mocking whisper about the loan documents sitting in Elijah's briefcase. She asked Jamal exactly who forged his father's signature on the collateral agreement. Chelsea explicitly stated that if he even thought about touching her money, she would walk straight into the police precinct and personally hand over the evidence of his forgery. She told him he was the one who legally signed away the family mansion and the church land, and he would be the only one wearing handcuffs by sunset. They viciously tore each other apart in the middle of that lavish living room, completely unaware that they were not the only ones listening to this explosive confession. Across town at the prestigious megachurch, my mother Vivica was sitting at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. It was the monthly meeting of the elite charity committee. She had spent the entire morning desperately trying to maintain her flawless facade after the absolute disaster of the gala the night before. She sat in the opulent committee room, surrounded by the wealthiest wives in Atlanta, acting as if the rumors of her husband's bankruptcy were nothing but jealous whispers. Behind my mother, the massive high-definition projection screens, usually reserved for church presentations, hung silently on the wall. Vivica was in the middle of delivering a passionate speech about the importance of family legacy and morality. She smiled brightly at the other committee members, talking about how her son Jamal was the perfect example of ethical business leadership. She had absolutely no idea that my tech team had spent the last 48 hours quietly hacking into the mansion's internal smart home system. Every security camera and every microphone in my parents' living room was fully under my control. Right as my mother raised her coffee cup to propose a new fundraising drive, the massive screens behind her suddenly flickered to life. The soft church music playing in the background was instantly cut off. It was replaced by the deafening, high-quality audio of Chelsea screaming at Jamal. The elite committee members froze, dropping their pens and staring at the screens in pure shock. The live feed displayed Jamal and Chelsea standing in the family living room tearing each other to pieces. My mother's coffee cup shattered against the mahogany table. The crystal-clear audio echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the church room. The entire committee sat in dead silence as they watched Chelsea mock Jamal for being a failure. They listened in horror as Jamal screamed about the stolen $2 million. And then, the final devastating blow echoed through the speakers. Chelsea explicitly yelled that Jamal had forged Desmond's signature to secure a shadow loan and that he had completely lost the family mansion and the very church land they were currently sitting on. Vivica could not breathe. She turned around slowly, her face completely drained of blood. She stared at the giant screen, watching her golden boy openly confess to federal fraud and the total destruction of their empire. The other wealthy wives began whispering frantically, backing away from the table as if my mother were suddenly contagious. The flawless facade she had spent her entire life building was completely obliterated in front of the exact people she wanted to impress the most. The ultimate betrayal had just been broadcast live, and my family was officially out of places to hide. The fallout from the live broadcast at the church committee meeting was catastrophic. My mother's pristine reputation was completely burned to the ground in a matter of minutes. As the wealthy wives fled the room in horror, whispering frantically into their cell phones, my father Desmond was summoned to face the absolute wreckage of his legacy. He burst into the mega church administrative wing, his face a mask of pure panic and fury. Jamal had been dragged into the pastoral suite looking like a cornered rat sweating through his expensive designer shirt. I watched the entire exchange through the internal security cameras my tech team had effortlessly compromised. I expected my father to finally unleash his righteous anger and punish his golden boy for forging his signature and destroying the family logistics empire. I expected him to act like the moral pillar of the community he pretended to be every single Sunday standing at the pulpit. Instead, Desmond slammed the heavy oak doors shut and completely ignored the fact that his son had committed textbook federal fraud. He did not care about the ethics or the law or the sheer betrayal. He only cared about saving his own face and preserving their lavish, untouchable lifestyle. He grabbed Jamal by the collar of his jacket and demanded to know exactly how much cash was needed to pay off Obsidian Capital and buy back the seized collateral before the banks went public. Jamal was shaking uncontrollably as he admitted that the logistics accounts were completely frozen and Chelsea's offshore stash was permanently locked down under a federal fraud investigation. He told our father that they needed at least $4 million in liquid cash before sunset, or the foreclosure would hit the evening news and the police would be knocking on their front door. Desmond released his son and began pacing the length of his lavish pastoral office. He looked at the massive gold cross hanging on the wall and then made a decision so utterly repulsive it proved exactly why I needed to destroy him. My father calmly walked over to his mahogany desk and booted up his private computer terminal. He told Jamal to wipe his face and stop crying because he had a solution to save them both. Desmond explained that the church had just concluded a massive 3-year fundraising drive for the Global Orphan Outreach Program. There was exactly $4.5 million sitting in a high-yield charity account waiting to be distributed to vulnerable children overseas. Desmond held the sole executive authorization over those funds. He justified the theft instantly, telling Jamal that God would understand they needed to borrow the money to protect the church's leadership from a public scandal that would ruin the congregation. He planned to drain the orphan fund completely, wire the money to a dummy corporation, and use it to buy out the toxic debt I was holding over their heads. He promised Jamal they would quietly pay the orphans back over the next 10 years, and no one would ever be the wiser. It was the ultimate betrayal of everything he claimed to stand for. He was willing to steal from desperate, helpless children just to cover up his son's criminal incompetence and protect his own bruised ego. Desmond sat down in his high-backed leather chair and quickly pulled up the secure banking portal. His hands were trembling with adrenaline as he typed in his pastoral credentials, preparing to execute the massive wire transfer. He actually smiled, a sick, triumphant smile, believing he had just found the perfect escape hatch. He thought he was untouchable behind the sacred walls of his megachurch shielded by his righteous facade. He had absolutely no idea that I was already walking down the carpeted hallway right toward his private sanctuary. The church security guards had not even tried to stop me. My legal team had already served them with the preliminary injunctions proving that the physical church property was part of the collateral Jamal had foolishly signed away to my firm. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to the pastoral office without knocking. My father and brother jumped out of their seats as if they had just been struck by lightning. Desmond slammed his laptop shut, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute indignation. He demanded to know how I got into his private office and ordered me to leave the holy grounds immediately. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon that booming pastoral voice that commanded thousands of people every Sunday. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was a wicked, vindictive child who had brought nothing but pain to our family. He swore that he was about to fix everything Jamal had broken and that my pathetic attempt to ruin them had completely failed. He boasted that he had the financial backing of the entire congregation and that my little debt collection agency was no match for the resources he commanded. Jamal stood behind him, nodding eagerly, suddenly finding his fake courage now that his father was protecting him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I walked slowly across the expensive Persian rug, my heels sinking into the plush fabric. I stopped right in front of his massive desk and looked down at the closed laptop. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy dossier stamped with official government seals. I did not hand it to him gently. I tossed the heavy stack of documents directly onto his pristine desk, letting the papers slide across the polished wood and knock over his expensive pen set. Desmond flinched, looking down at the federal insignia glaring back at him. I looked my father dead in the eye and let a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. I told him he was right about one thing. He was about to initiate a wire transfer. But I told him to open the laptop and check the account balance before he made any more promises he could not keep. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the edge of his desk. I stated clearly and calmly that he would not be getting a single dime to save his sinking ship. I informed him that my forensic accountants had audited the church financials during the corporate takeover and flagged his highly suspicious account activities. I watched the blood drain from his face as I delivered the final blow. I told him the orphan fund was transferred to federal oversight this morning. Desmond stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from the heavy federal dossier on his desk to my face, trying to find any trace of a bluff or a joke. There was none to be found. I had contacted the Federal Charity Commission weeks ago, anonymously submitting the glaring financial irregularities I had easily uncovered in his pastoral accounts. The exact moment he attempted to log into the secure banking portal to drain the Global Orphan Fund, he triggered a massive silent alarm that locked the entire system down. He slammed his heavy fists onto the polished mahogany desk, sending a gold pen rolling off the edge and into the plush carpet. His face turned a dangerous shade of dark crimson and the thick veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He realized instantly that his perfect escape plan was completely dead. The millions he intended to steal to save his fake empire were entirely out of his reach, and now federal agents were actively monitoring his every move. Jamal backed away into the far corner of the office looking absolutely terrified. He was shaking so badly he could barely stand upright. He knew that without the stolen charity money, there was nothing standing between him and a federal prison sentence. Desmond, however, refused to accept defeat. The blinding, arrogant pride that had defined his entire life took over his rational thoughts. He stood up perfectly straight and puffed out his chest, trying to summon the booming, authoritative voice he used to command thousands of loyal followers every single Sunday morning. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and ordered me to get out of his sanctuary immediately. When I did not move a single inch, he lost his temper completely. He began screaming for the private security detail stationed in the hallway outside his office. He yelled for them to come inside and remove a hostile trespasser from his holy grounds. The heavy oak doors pushed open, and 3 large men in dark tailored suits stepped into the pastoral office. Desmond commanded them to grab me by my arms and physically throw me out onto the concrete street. He told them I was a deranged, jealous woman trespassing on private property and disturbing the peace of his congregation. He waited for them to execute his orders with the absolute blind obedience he was so used to receiving. But the 3 men simply stood there. They looked at Desmond, and then they looked quietly at me, and they folded their hands in front of them perfectly still. Desmond's voice cracked as he yelled at them again, demanding to know why they were hesitating. He reminded them angrily that he was the senior pastor and that he personally signed their paychecks every 2 weeks. He screamed that if they did not remove me this very second, they would all be completely fired before lunch. The head of the security team, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Marcus, finally spoke. He did not raise his voice or look intimidated by my father's holy rage. He calmly informed Desmond that he no longer had the authority to fire anyone on the premises. Desmond looked like he had been physically slapped across the face. He demanded to know what Marcus was talking about. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing right in front of the mahogany desk. I kept my voice perfectly level and ice cold. I told my father that Jamal had been incredibly sloppy when he signed the collateral agreements for the $5 million shadow loan. I explained that in his desperate rush to secure the cash for Chelsea, he had pledged the logistics company warehouses, the family estate, and the primary holding corporation that owned the physical land underneath this very megachurch. I watched the devastating realization slowly wash over my father's face as I spelled out the brutal truth. I told him that since the loan had officially defaulted at midnight, all of those assets now legally belonged to Obsidian Capital. I explained that my firm was the new registered owner of the church grounds, the parking structures, the administrative wings, and the pastoral office we were currently standing in. I looked at the security guards and told my father that I was the one who signed their paychecks now. They were my employees, and they answered exclusively to me. I had already briefed the entire security team earlier this morning about the transition of power. They were not there to throw me out. They were there to make sure my father and brother did not try to destroy any documents or steal any physical assets on their way out the door. Desmond completely lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. The holy righteous man vanished entirely, and a vicious, cruel monster took his place. He slammed his hands against the desk again and unleashed a hateful tirade that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the suite. He cursed me, calling me a demon and a mistake. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, wretched child who had been sent specifically to ruin his life. He yelled that he and Vivica should have never taken care of me when I was young, and that I was nothing but a poisonous snake biting the hand that fed it. He claimed that I was destroying a legacy built by God himself, and that I would burn for tearing down a sacred institution just to satisfy my own petty, vindictive jealousy. He paced frantically behind his desk, spitting venom and trying to crush my spirit with the same emotional abuse he had used to control me my entire childhood. He told me that I was a bitter, lonely woman who would never know true power or respect no matter how much money I hoarded. He pointed at me and declared that he was still Desmond the great community leader, and that his massive congregation would rise up and defend him against my wicked corporate theft. He swore that he would tie me up in endless litigation for decades and make sure I spent every single cent I had fighting him in court. He yelled that I had absolutely nothing on him and that he would always be 10 steps ahead of a pathetic girl like me. I listened to his entire pathetic rant without blinking. I did not absorb a single drop of his toxic hatred. I simply reached into the pocket of my emerald gown and pulled out my cell phone. I looked down at the screen and tapped one single button, executing a digital command I had prepared hours ago. A loud, sharp ding echoed through the quiet tension of the office. It did not come from my phone. It came from the sleek silver device sitting right next to Desmond's discarded gold pen. My father stopped breathing heavily and looked down at his phone. The screen lit up with an urgent priority text message. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked it up. I watched his eyes scan the short notification, and I watched the last remaining piece of his soul shatter into dust. The message was a direct alert from his elite banking concierge informing him that his personal mansion had officially gone into foreclosure. Desmond dropped his phone onto the polished mahogany desk, as if the device had physically burned his hand. He stumbled backward and collapsed into his heavy leather chair, completely defeated by the reality of his own arrogant mistakes. I did not stay to watch him process the total destruction of his empire. I simply turned around and walked out of the pastoral office, leaving my father and brother trapped in the ruins of their own making. My work at the megachurch was finished, but there was still one more piece of collateral I needed to personally secure. I walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight and got into my waiting car, instructing my driver to head directly to the family estate. The drive to the sprawling suburban mansion took less than 20 minutes. We cruised through the exclusive gated community where my parents had spent years pretending to be untouchable royalty. The massive wrought iron gates of their property were already locked open by the property seizure team my firm had dispatched earlier that afternoon. Moving trucks were lined up along the circular driveway, waiting for the official green light to begin emptying the lavish estate. I walked past the marble fountains and stepped through the grand double doors of the foyer. The house was in absolute chaos. Designer clothes and expensive handbags were scattered across the sweeping staircase. I found Chelsea in the master suite, tearing through her massive walk-in closet like a frantic, trapped animal. She was aggressively stuffing diamond jewelry and luxury watches into a leather duffel bag, trying to salvage whatever liquid assets she could carry before the banks froze the property. She froze when she saw me standing in the doorway of her bedroom. Her perfectly manicured face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. She demanded to know what I was doing in her house and ordered me to get out before she called security to have me dragged away. I leaned against the doorframe and calmly informed her that this was no longer her house. I told her that Jamal had foolishly signed away the deed to my firm and that my team was currently downstairs, cataloging the imported furniture for immediate auction. Chelsea dropped the duffel bag and lunged toward me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. She screamed that I could not do this to her and that she had spent years tolerating my pathetic brother just to secure her wealthy lifestyle. She swore she was leaving Jamal anyway and that she had her own offshore money waiting for her in the Cayman Islands. I let a slow, satisfied smile spread across my face as I told her she might want to check the current status of her hidden accounts. I explained that my forensic accountants had already handed all of her fake vendor invoices and offshore wire transfers directly to federal authorities. I watched her perfectly polished facade crack and shatter into a million pieces as she realized her hidden millions were completely gone. Chelsea was backed into a tight corner and she knew it. But instead of accepting defeat, she decided to use the most dangerous weapon she had left in her arsenal. She backed away from me and grabbed her cell phone from the marble nightstand. She stared at me with cold, calculating malice and dialed emergency services. The moment the dispatcher answered, Chelsea's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her voice began to tremble and break as she forced herself into a state of sheer manufactured panic. She started sobbing hysterically into the phone, claiming that there was an aggressive black woman trespassing in her home and threatening her life. She paced around the bedroom, weeping and gasping for air, putting on the performance of a lifetime. She told the dispatcher that I was violent and unstable, and that she was trapped in her bedroom, terrified that I was going to physically attack her. She begged the police to hurry, saying she feared for her absolute safety and did not know what I was capable of doing to her. It was a vicious, calculated attempt to weaponize the police against me. She knew exactly what she was doing, playing the fragile, terrified victim in hopes that the armed authorities would arrive and immediately escalate the situation against me. I did not move a single muscle. I stood there in complete silence, watching her cry those fake, bitter tears. I did not raise my voice or attempt to stop her or argue with her lies. I simply waited. Chelsea hung up the phone and wiped her eyes, dropping the hysterical victim routine the exact second the call disconnected. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and told me that I was going to spend the next 10 years in a prison cell for home invasion and assault. She boasted that the police would always believe a terrified woman in distress over someone like me. Within 10 minutes, the deafening sound of police sirens echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed through the large bedroom windows as multiple squad cars slammed into park on the front driveway. Heavy footsteps pounded up the main marble staircase. Chelsea immediately threw herself onto the floor and began weeping loudly, perfectly timing her distress for the arriving officers. 3 police officers burst into the master suite, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Chelsea scrambled toward them, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. She wailed that I had broken into her house and threatened to kill her, demanding that they arrest me immediately and get me away from her. She clung to the nearest officer's arm, acting completely traumatized and begging for protection from the aggressive intruder. The officers looked at her, and then they looked at me. I calmly reached into my tailored jacket pocket and pulled out my corporate identification alongside the legal property deed, confirming my absolute ownership of the estate. The lead officer, a tall captain with a stern, uncompromising expression, took the documents and reviewed them quickly. He handed them back to me with a polite nod. He did not ask me to put my hands behind my back. He did not draw his weapon. He simply walked right past me. Chelsea stopped crying, completely confused, as the captain approached her instead. He grabbed her arm and firmly pulled her up from the floor, twisting her wrists behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the quiet bedroom. Chelsea began screaming and thrashing, demanding to know what they were doing and insisting that they had the wrong person. The captain stared at her with absolute authority and stated clearly that Chelsea was under arrest for wire fraud and international money laundering under FBI orders. Chelsea let out a piercing shriek that sounded like a wild animal caught in a trap. She thrashed against the heavy grip of the police officers, kicking her expensive designer heels against the polished marble floor, but the captain did not show a single ounce of pity. He read her rights in a flat, absolute monotone voice, completely ignoring her desperate, frantic demands to call her high-priced lawyers. The other officers grabbed her firmly by the shoulders and marched her forcefully out of the lavish master suite. Jamal had been standing frozen in the upstairs hallway, paralyzed by the flashing red and blue police lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and the absolute total collapse of his perfectly manicured world. When he saw his wife being dragged out in heavy steel handcuffs, his knees immediately buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the plush carpet right in the middle of the grand sweeping staircase. He did not run down to comfort Chelsea or demand that the police tell him where they were taking her. Instead, the golden boy of the family immediately tried to save his own pathetic skin. He started shouting frantically at the officers that he had absolutely no idea what his wife was doing behind his back. He pointed a shaking, panicked finger at Chelsea as she was hauled out the front double doors, screaming that she had brutally manipulated him from the very beginning, and that she was a pathological liar who hid her illegal offshore accounts from him. He cried out that he was totally innocent and that Chelsea had single-handedly ruined his entire life and the family business. Chelsea twisted her head around viciously as the officers pushed her toward the waiting police cruiser in the driveway. She glared back at her sobbing husband with pure, unadulterated venom and spat back that he was a weak, pathetic coward who would not last a single day in a federal penitentiary. The heavy doors of the squad car slammed shut loudly, cutting off her furious, endless insults. The flashing police lights continued to illuminate the circular driveway as another luxury vehicle came skidding dangerously through the open wrought iron gates. It was my mother, Vivica. She had practically flown her car away from the megachurch after the disastrous live broadcast, completely abandoning her elite charity committee members in a frantic, desperate rush to find and protect her precious son. She stumbled blindly out of her vehicle, completely ignoring the departing police cruisers, and ran straight into the mansion with her designer dress trailing behind her. Vivica burst into the massive foyer and immediately saw Jamal kneeling on the floor at the bottom of the stairs, weeping loudly like a helpless, terrified child. She threw herself onto the carpet next to him, wrapping her arms fiercely and protectively around his shaking shoulders. She pulled his head tight against her chest, rocking him back and forth, and whispering repeatedly that everything was going to be perfectly fine and that she would fix this disaster. Then she looked up and saw me standing calmly at the top of the marble staircase, holding the official property deed in my hands. Her face instantly contorted into a mask of pure, irrational hatred. Vivica unleashed a barrage of vicious, screaming insults, blaming me entirely for every single disaster that had befallen our prestigious family that afternoon. She screamed that I was a heartless, evil monster who was obsessively dedicated to destroying my own brother just to prove a selfish point. She yelled that Jamal was a good, honest man who had simply made a few naive business mistakes and that I was sick in the head for calling the federal authorities on his wife. She declared fiercely that God would eternally punish me for tearing my own blood relatives apart and for stealing the family home right out from under them. She squeezed Jamal even tighter against her chest, telling me that he was the only true rightful heir to the logistics empire and that my bitter, lifelong jealousy was tearing the family legacy to shreds. I slowly walked down the grand marble staircase, my footsteps echoing clearly in the massive foyer over the sound of Jamal's pathetic sobbing. I did not yell back or defend myself against her toxic, ridiculous delusions. I simply looked down at the pathetic scene unfolding on the expensive rug. I told my mother that her perfect golden boy was not just a terrible, incompetent businessman who forged signatures and lost millions of dollars. I told her that Jamal was a desperate, dangerous coward who was willing to do absolutely anything to silence the sister who finally caught him in his massive web of lies. Vivica sneered at me harshly, demanding to know what malicious, fabricated lies I was spinning now to make him look bad. She swore passionately that she would never believe a single word out of my mouth ever again, and that my attempts to frame Jamal were useless. I did not need her to believe my words. I only needed her to believe his. I reached into the pocket of my emerald suit and pulled out my cell phone, navigating smoothly to a secure audio file my private investigators had intercepted just 48 hours ago. Jamal had been so panicked about the impending corporate audit that he blindly reached out to a shadowy criminal contact he had met through one of Chelsea's fake offshore vendors. I turned the volume on my phone all the way up and pressed play, holding the device out so my mother could hear every single syllable clearly. The crystal-clear audio filled the silent grand foyer. It was Jamal's voice, frantic, desperate, and trembling with fear. He was speaking to an unknown man, demanding to know exactly how much cash it would cost to make a massive problem permanently disappear. The deep voice on the recording asked Jamal who the specific target was. Jamal's voice echoed loudly off the marble walls, explicitly stating my full first and last name. He told the hitman that I was about to expose his massive federal fraud and seize the entire family estate. He eagerly promised to pay $200,000 in untraceable cryptocurrency if the man could successfully orchestrate a fatal car accident before the end of the week. He literally begged the man on the phone to kill his own sister, saying it was the absolute only way he could inherit the empire and stay out of federal prison. The recording clicked off, leaving a suffocating dead silence hanging in the massive room. Vivica stopped rocking him. Her entire body went completely rigid and cold. She slowly loosened her protective grip on her golden boy. She looked down at Jamal, who had buried his face deeply in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably, because he knew there was absolutely no way to lie his way out of this damning evidence. The horrifying reality of what she had just heard crashed down on her like a collapsing concrete building. The son she had blindly worshipped her entire life, the boy she had relentlessly protected and elevated above me at every single turn, had actively tried to hire a hitman to brutally murder her own daughter. Vivica let out a quiet, horrified gasp that seemed to tear the air out of her lungs. She pushed herself violently backward, crawling away from Jamal as if he were suddenly covered in a deadly infectious disease. She dropped her precious golden boy in sheer unadulterated horror, her eyes wide with a paralyzing terror that no amount of prayer or denial could ever wash away. Vivica, backing away from Jamal in sheer horror, was the final image I took with me as I walked out of the seized family estate. I left them there in the grand foyer, completely broken and entirely divided. My brother was a sobbing mess on the floor, and my mother was finally seeing the monster she had created and protected her entire life. But the war was not entirely over yet. I knew my father Desmond was still breathing, and as long as he had a single ounce of pride left in his veins, he would try to fight back. He had lost his megachurch and his lavish mansion, but he still believed he held the ultimate trump card. He still had his elite connections. Desmond spent the entire weekend locked inside a luxury hotel suite, desperately trying to salvage the burning wreckage of his legacy. He could not accept that a daughter he had discarded and completely underestimated had dismantled his empire in a matter of days. He resorted to the only tactic he had left, which was leveraging his immense social capital. He spent 48 hours making frantic phone calls to his most powerful allies. He reached out to the billionaire investors, the corrupt church elders, and the wealthy corporate titans who sat on the executive board of his overarching holding company. This was the board that controlled the final remaining shell assets and the massive logistical contracts that had originally built his fortune. He fed them a pathetic, fabricated story about how I was a deranged, vindictive child trying to orchestrate an illegal, hostile takeover. He begged them to stand by his side, promising them massive returns and exclusive church contracts if they helped him crush me. By Monday morning, my father had completely convinced himself that he was untouchable again. He called for a mandatory emergency board meeting at 9 o'clock sharp. He intended to use his wealthy friends to force a unanimous executive vote that would permanently strip me of my newly acquired shares and legally paralyze my firm in decades of aggressive litigation. He truly believed that the Old Boys Club would protect him because they always had. I arrived at the towering glass high-rise in the center of the financial district exactly 15 minutes early. The morning sun was reflecting brightly off the polished steel and glass as I stepped into the private elevator. I rode it all the way up to the penthouse executive suite where the emergency meeting was scheduled to take place. My emerald green suit matched the cold, calculated energy I brought with me into that building. I was not nervous or intimidated by the thought of facing a room full of powerful billionaires. I was incredibly eager to watch my father play his final losing hand. I pushed open the heavy frosted glass doors of the massive boardroom. Desmond was already inside, standing proudly at the head of a long, polished mahogany conference table. He was wearing his most expensive custom-tailored suit, and his posture was completely rigid with arrogant defiance. The sheer panic he had shown in his pastoral office on Friday was completely gone. He had replaced it with a sickening, smug confidence. When he saw me walk into the room entirely alone, his face twisted into a vicious, mocking smile. He let out a loud, condescending laugh that echoed off the floor to ceiling windows. He told me that I was extremely foolish for actually showing up. He paced back and forth at the head of the table, boasting that my little childish revenge plot was officially dead. He pointed a finger at me and proudly declared that he had spent the entire weekend rallying the true owners of the city. He warned me that his billionaire friends were absolutely furious with my insolence and that they were fully prepared to crush me into the dirt. Desmond leaned heavily against the mahogany table and tried to lecture me about the reality of power. He stated that money was absolutely useless without loyalty and established brotherhood. He called me an arrogant amateur who thought she could walk into a man's world and dictate the rules. He promised me that in exactly 5 minutes, the entire executive board would walk through those doors and vote to completely obliterate me. He swore that I would be left with absolutely nothing, and that he would personally ensure I was banned from every financial institution in the country. I did not say a single word to interrupt his pathetic delusional rant. I simply walked over to the opposite end of the long conference table and pulled out the largest leather executive chair. I sat down, crossed my legs, and rested my hands smoothly on the polished wood. I looked my father dead in the eye and let a cold, satisfied smile spread across my face. I told him I was very much looking forward to meeting his loyal friends. Exactly at 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Desmond immediately stood up taller, puffing out his chest and buttoning his suit jacket. He prepared his most charming pastoral smile, ready to welcome his wealthy saviors. 12 elite shareholders walked into the boardroom in a single file line. These were the absolute titans of industry, the ruthless old money billionaires that Desmond had played golf with and colluded with for over 3 decades. Desmond opened his arms wide and loudly welcomed them to the meeting, eagerly thanking them for coming to save his legacy, but his words completely died in his throat. Not a single one of the billionaire shareholders even looked at my father. They did not shake his outstretched hand or acknowledge his presence in any way whatsoever. They treated him like an invisible ghost. Instead, the entire group of powerful men walked straight past Desmond's end of the table and made their way directly down the length of the room toward me. The lead shareholder, an intimidating silver-haired tycoon named Marcus, stopped right in front of my chair. He looked at me with an expression of absolute submission and gave a deep, highly respectful bow of his head. Instantly, the other 11 billionaires followed his exact movement, bowing silently to me in perfect synchronized unison. Desmond was hyperventilating, his face turning completely pale and draining of all color. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He started stammering and demanding to know what was going on and asking why his lifelong friends were bowing to his disgraced daughter. He looked around the room in sheer terror, realizing that the very men he brought in to destroy me were suddenly treating me like royalty. I leaned back comfortably in my leather chair and looked at my trembling father. I calmly informed him that he was absolutely right about one thing. Loyalty in the corporate world was everything. But I told him that loyalty always had a price tag, and his friends were simply too expensive for a bankrupt pastor to afford. I watched the absolute devastation crush him as I explained exactly what I had done over the weekend. While he was busy crying in a hotel room and begging for favors, I had ruthlessly liquidated my entire personal net worth. I took $36 million in pure liquid cash and used every single penny to buy out the entire executive board. I paid them triple the market value for their voting shares and their absolute unshakable obedience. I looked my father in the eyes and delivered the final fatal blow. I told him they did not belong to him anymore because I had bought their loyalty entirely. I watched my father's eyes dart wildly around the massive penthouse boardroom as his entire reality crumbled into dust. Marcus and the other 11 billionaires did not offer him a single shred of sympathy. They stepped aside in perfect unison, clearing a wide path for me to walk toward the head of the long mahogany conference table. I walked slowly past my defeated father and pulled back the heavy leather chairman's seat that he had occupied for over 30 years. I sat down, crossing my legs and resting my hands smoothly on the polished wood. Desmond was trembling uncontrollably, his face pale and slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He looked desperately at his former golfing buddies and begged them to say something to intervene and tell him this was all just a vicious misunderstanding. But Marcus simply looked away, and the other billionaires quietly took their seats along the sides of the table, remaining perfectly silent and completely obedient to their new owner. Desmond finally realized that his immense wealth and elite social connections could no longer save him. He turned back to face me, and his entire demeanor abruptly changed. The arrogant corporate titan completely vanished, and the manipulative mega-church pastor took his place. He straightened his expensive silk tie and forced a calm, paternal tone, trying desperately to weaponize the holy authority he had used to control millions of gullible people for his entire career. He told me that money had blinded my soul and that I was letting worldly greed destroy the sacred holy bond of our family. He paced slowly near the floor-to-ceiling windows, preaching about loyalty and bloodlines, claiming that God was watching my wicked actions and weeping for my corrupted, vindictive heart. He continued his pathetic sermon, laying the spiritual guilt on as thick as he possibly could. He told me that he and Vivica had raised me under the righteous roof of their holy empire, and that turning against my own father was the ultimate unforgivable sin. He dropped his voice to a theatrical, dramatic whisper, putting his hands together as if he were deep in sincere prayer. He begged me to look deep inside my soul and find the grace to forgive my brother and my parents for our past misunderstandings. He actually tried to claim that the horrifying audio recording of Jamal hiring a hitman was simply a cry for help from a lost, troubled sheep. He quoted scripture about prodigal children and divine redemption, insisting that a true righteous daughter would surrender the corporate shares back to him immediately to protect the church and the family legacy from total public ruin. He stepped closer to the head of the table, leaning over the polished mahogany wood and trying to look directly into my eyes with fake pastoral compassion. He told me that no amount of corporate power or billions of dollars would ever replace the unconditional love of a father. He promised that if I walked away right now and gave him back total control of his company, he would publicly forgive my trespasses and welcome me back into his holy sanctuary with open arms. He swore that the entire megachurch congregation would pray for my troubled soul and that we could move forward as a united, loving family, completely ignoring the fact that they had treated me like absolute disposable garbage my entire life. The powerful billionaires sitting around the conference table remained completely silent, watching the pathetic display of spiritual manipulation without showing a single trace of emotion. I did not blink or look away from his desperate, sweating face. I let him finish his entire hypocritical, disgusting sermon. I let the heavy silence hang in the cold air of the penthouse boardroom until his fake, compassionate smile began to violently tremble and break. I leaned forward in the chairman's seat and clasped my hands together on the desk, mirroring his prayerful gesture. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth as I prepared to destroy his final pathetic illusion of control. I told my father that his holy manipulation might work on the thousands of desperate, vulnerable followers he scams out of their paychecks every single Sunday, but it would never work on me again. I reminded him that he stood by and did absolutely nothing while my brother tried to steal my future and eagerly enabled his wife when she tried to have me thrown in federal prison. I reminded him that his precious family loyalty only ever applied to his golden boy, while I was deliberately starved of affection and respect. Desmond stammered frantically, trying to quote another random scripture about divine grace and turning the other cheek to those who wrong us. I cut him off completely right in the middle of his holy verse. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him that forgiveness is God's job and my job is arranging the meeting. Desmond recoiled violently, as if he had been physically struck in the chest by a speeding freight train. His mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no words came out. He realized in that exact second that he had completely and totally lost the war. His hidden money was gone, his massive megachurch was seized, his lavish estate was empty, and his powerful board of directors belonged exclusively to me. There were no more dirty tricks left to play, and no more fake prayers that could possibly save him from his own destruction. I reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, placing them firmly on the table directly in front of me. I slid a heavy gold pen from my tailored jacket pocket and uncapped it with a sharp, definitive click that echoed loudly in the silent room. I told Desmond that the legal documents on the table represented the final official restructuring of the overarching holding corporation. I read the top page aloud to the entire board, noting that due to gross financial mismanagement, severe ethical violations, and extreme criminal negligence, the former chairman was being permanently removed from all corporate and pastoral duties effective immediately. Desmond watched in paralyzed absolute horror as I pressed the tip of the gold pen to the pristine white paper. I told him that he was walking out of this building with absolutely nothing to his name. I signed my signature on the dotted line, executing the immediate termination papers and officially stripping my father of his entire multi-million-dollar corporate pension. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed behind my father, leaving him completely alone with his shattered legacy. I did not waste another second thinking about Desmond or his total collapse. I simply gathered my documents and walked out of the building, stepping into the crisp morning air with a profound sense of absolute clarity. The media had already caught wind of the corporate massacre, and the federal indictments against my brother were making front-page news across the country. The great logistics empire built on lies and stolen charity funds was officially mine to liquidate and restructure. I spent the next 3 days sitting in my corner office at Obsidian Capital, overseeing the massive transition of assets. The family estate had been completely emptied and padlocked by my security teams. All of their luxury vehicles were seized, and their frozen bank accounts left them with absolutely nothing to their names. It was Thursday afternoon when my private intercom buzzed. My head of security calmly informed me that an older woman was causing a frantic scene down in the main lobby. She was weeping hysterically and begging the front desk receptionist to let her see the chief executive officer. I knew exactly who it was. I instructed Marcus to escort my mother up to my office, but to remain standing right outside the heavy wooden door. I wanted to see exactly what total desperation looked like on the woman who had spent my entire childhood treating me like a worthless mistake. The heavy glass doors pushed open, and Vivica stumbled into my suite. The transformation was absolutely shocking to witness. The perfectly polished elite socialite was completely gone. Her expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and deeply stained with dirt and sweat. Her hair was unwashed and her face was pale and drawn, looking aged beyond her years. She looked like a hollow, broken shell of the arrogant woman who had screamed at me in the foyer just a few days ago. She took one look at me sitting behind my massive desk, and she instantly crumbled. She fell to her knees right on the plush carpet and began sobbing uncontrollably, hiding her face in her trembling hands. I did not stand up or offer her a tissue. I simply leaned back in my leather chair and waited for the performance to begin. Vivica crawled forward slightly and began pleading with a pathetic broken voice that echoed in the large room. She begged me to show her mercy, claiming that she had lost absolutely everything in the blink of an eye. She wailed that Desmond was facing decades in federal prison and that Jamal was completely ruined and facing his own criminal charges. She told me that the banks had seized her personal credit cards and that she had been forced to sleep on a cheap motel mattress for the past 3 nights, listening to sirens and fighting off roaches. She looked up at me with tear-streaked cheeks and begged me to give her back the family house. She swore that she could not survive out there in the real world among regular struggling people. She told me that she had never worked a real job in her entire life and that she was far too old and fragile to start living in a poor, dangerous neighborhood. She tried to manipulate my emotions using the exact same toxic tactics she had relied on since I was a little girl. She reminded me that she carried me in her womb and gave me life, insisting that a daughter owes her mother a basic level of care and respect, no matter what mistakes were made in the past. She cried that family was supposed to protect each other when times got hard, and that leaving her homeless was an unnatural, wicked sin that would taint my soul forever. I listened to her desperate, pathetic begging without feeling a single drop of sympathy. I looked at the woman kneeling on my floor, and I did not see a mother. I only saw a cruel, selfish enabler who had gladly watched me suffer whenever it benefited her golden boy. I kept my face perfectly still, and my voice ice cold, as I reminded her that she had never once acted like a mother to me when I actually needed one. I watched her eyes dart around the room nervously as I slowly opened the top drawer of my desk. I told Vivica that her sudden, desperate plea for family loyalty was incredibly ironic considering how she had treated me 10 years ago. I forced her to listen as I recounted the darkest moment of my entire life. I reminded her of the night I was rushed to the emergency room with a severe, life-threatening infection. I was completely alone, terrified, and drowning in massive medical debt that I could not possibly pay on a minimum wage salary while attending night classes. I reminded her that I had called her from my hospital bed weeping in agonizing pain and begging my own mother for a tiny fraction of the financial help she so freely threw at Jamal every single day. I watched Vivica flinch and look away as the brutal memory washed over her. I told her that I would never ever forget the sound of her annoyed, irritated sigh on the other end of the phone while hospital machines beeped around me. I repeated the exact cruel words she had spat at me while I was lying in that sterile hospital bed fighting for my life. She had told me that I was a grown woman who needed to stop begging for handouts and draining her energy. She had told me that she was busy preparing for a luxury cruise with Desmond and could not be bothered with my endless dramatic problems. I reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a cheap, glossy pamphlet. I tossed it carelessly across the polished desk, letting it slide right to the edge where she was kneeling on the floor. Vivica reached up with shaking fingers and took the brochure. She looked down at the cover, and her face went entirely white, dropping the paper as if it had burned her skin. It was a brochure for a bleak, overcrowded, low-income state-funded nursing home located in one of the most dangerous and impoverished neighborhoods in the city. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, and looked directly into her terrified, widening eyes. I kept my voice completely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness, as the past finally came full circle. I told her that 10 years ago when I was hospitalized, she had told me she had no money for me, and that I needed to figure it out myself. I watched her entire spirit shatter into dust as I delivered the final devastating blow. I told her that now it was her turn to figure it out. I pressed the security button under my desk and told Marcus to come inside and remove the trespasser from my building permanently. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and Marcus escorted my weeping mother down to the lobby and out of my life forever. The absolute silence that filled my office was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. My hostile takeover of the family empire was entirely complete, but the federal justice system still had a massive score to settle with my brother and his treacherous wife. The grand marble hallways of the federal courthouse became the final public stage for the destruction of my father's legacy. 7 months after I seized the estate, the highly publicized criminal trial of Jamal and Chelsea finally reached its bitter end. The courtroom was packed every single day with greedy journalists, former church members, and curious onlookers wanting to see the glorious fall of the local elite. Jamal and Chelsea sat at separate defense tables, refusing to even look at each other. The tension in the room was incredibly thick and toxic. Chelsea's family had emptied their remaining trust funds to hire a ruthless, high-profile defense attorney who was famous for twisting the truth into unrecognizable shapes. When it was his turn to present Chelsea's defense to the jury, he decided to use the most disgusting manipulative tactic possible. He decided to play the fragile victim card while heavily leaning into vicious racial and class stereotypes. The lawyer paced back and forth in front of the jury box, painting a fabricated picture of Chelsea as a naive, innocent woman who had been dragged into a world she did not understand. He claimed that she was completely overwhelmed by the aggressive demands of my father's powerful black family and the intense, suffocating pressure of his massive church community. He shamelessly argued that Jamal was an aggressive, controlling husband who intimidated his terrified wife into signing illegal documents. He told the jury that Chelsea only participated in the financial crimes because she was terrified of what my family would do to her if she refused to maintain our lavish lifestyle. It was a sickening, racist narrative designed to make the jury view my brother as a violent thug and Chelsea as a helpless captive who was forced into international money laundering simply to survive. Jamal sat at his table with his head hanging low, looking absolutely pathetic as he listened to his wife completely destroy his character to save her own skin. He had spent his entire life elevating Chelsea above his own blood, treating her like a perfect queen, and now she was publicly portraying him as a monstrous abuser. The defense attorney rested his case, looking incredibly smug. He truly believed he had successfully planted enough toxic doubt in the minds of the jury to get Chelsea a full acquittal. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The lead federal prosecutor stood up and calmly announced that the state was calling its final expert witness to the stand to provide absolute clarity on the financial timeline. He called my name. A loud collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery as I stood up from the front row and walked confidently toward the witness box. Chelsea's lawyer let out a quiet, arrogant scoff, clearly assuming I was just a bitter, estranged sister brought in to give emotional testimony. He was completely wrong. The prosecutor did not ask me about my childhood or my family dynamics. He asked me to state my professional credentials for the official court record. I looked directly at the jury and introduced myself as the Chief Executive Officer of Obsidian Capital and the lead forensic financial investigator who had personally uncovered the entire criminal enterprise. I watched the smug smile completely melt off the defense attorney's face as he realized I was not there to talk about feelings. I was there to deliver the undeniable digital truth. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously dismantling Chelsea's disgusting racist defense brick by brick. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotion. I simply presented the cold, hard financial facts on the large courtroom monitors. I showed the jury the exact internet protocol addresses and digital timestamps proving that Chelsea had personally registered the fake shell companies in the Cayman Islands over a year before Jamal even knew the church was failing. I walked them through a massive chain of encrypted emails I had successfully recovered where Chelsea was aggressively coaching my brother on exactly how to forge Desmond's signature on the commercial property deeds. I pointed to the screens showing how Chelsea had secretly drained the Global Orphan Fund and routed the stolen millions directly into private accounts solely registered under her maiden name. I looked straight at Chelsea's pale, trembling face and told the jury that she was not a fragile, frightened victim of a demanding culture. She was the absolute mastermind who pulled every single string and used her husband as a convenient, pathetic shield. The digital footprint was entirely undeniable, and it proved that her entire defense was a malicious, calculated lie. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning to the courtroom with their final verdict. The heavy silence in the room was deafening as the judge read the results aloud. They found both of them completely guilty on all counts of wire fraud, international money laundering, and federal conspiracy. The judge did not hold back when it came time for sentencing. He looked at Chelsea with absolute disgust and condemned her for trying to use ugly racial stereotypes to hide her own wicked greed. Chelsea burst into real hysterical tears, sobbing loudly as the judge sentenced her to 10 brutal years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. She screamed for her lawyer as the court bailiffs grabbed her arms and dragged her toward the holding cells. Jamal did not scream or cry or fight back. He simply stared blankly at the wooden table completely hollowed out as the judge sentenced him to 8 years behind bars. I sat in the gallery and watched them both get led away in heavy steel handcuffs. I walked out of the federal courthouse and stepped into the warm afternoon sun, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. The warm afternoon sun felt incredibly validating on my skin as I drove directly from the federal courthouse to the sprawling seized estate in the wealthiest zip code of the city. Today was the absolute final deadline for my parents to vacate the premises and surrender the property to my liquidators. I pulled my sleek black sedan into the long circular driveway and parked right behind the massive moving truck that my firm had generously provided for them. The perfectly manicured front lawn was crawling with my private security contractors. They were standing like stone statues along the perimeter, making sure the eviction process went exactly according to my strict corporate schedule. Several of the elite wealthy neighbors had stepped out onto their sprawling porches and balconies, pretending to water their exotic plants while eagerly watching the mighty pastoral family get physically thrown out of their own castle. I stepped out of my car and smoothed down my tailored emerald suit, ready to personally oversee the permanent removal of the trash. I walked through the massive double doors and stepped into the grand foyer, where my parents were frantically stuffing their last remaining possessions into cheap cardboard boxes. The luxurious mansion looked completely stripped and terrifyingly hollow. All the custom furniture and expensive imported rugs had already been seized and catalogued by my liquidation team, leaving nothing but bare walls and echoing floors. Desmond was wearing a wrinkled, faded polo shirt and sweating profusely as he taped a box shut. His posture was completely broken, and he looked like a pathetic, defeated old man who had finally run out of lies. Vivica was darting nervously between the boxes, clutching a large, oversized designer tote bag tightly against her chest. She kept looking over her shoulder with wide, frantic eyes, moving with the jerky, desperate energy of a cornered rat. She was clearly trying to hide something massive inside the bag. I stood silently in the arched doorway and watched my mother attempt her final pathetic scam. She grabbed Desmond by the sleeve and aggressively whispered that they needed to leave immediately before my liquidation auditors returned to check the rooms. She adjusted the heavy tote bag and practically ran toward the front door, keeping her head down to avoid looking at the security guards posted in the hallway. I casually stepped directly into her path, blocking the exit with my body. Vivica gasped and stumbled backward, clutching the bag even tighter against her chest. Her face drained of all color when she looked up and saw me standing there with a cold, satisfied smile. I told her that she was free to leave the property, but her oversized bag needed to be thoroughly inspected before she took another step. Vivica immediately began screaming and throwing a massive theatrical tantrum. She claimed that I was violating her basic human rights and treating her like a common criminal in her own home. She marched out onto the front porch, loudly demanding respect and trying to draw sympathy from the wealthy neighbors who were watching the entire scene unfold from their pristine lawns. She dramatically yelled that a daughter should never treat her own flesh and blood with such vicious disrespect. I followed her outside and calmly signaled to my new head of security. I told Elijah to search the bag right there on the front steps, in full view of the entire elite neighborhood. Elijah stepped forward and effortlessly snatched the heavy tote bag from my mother's hands, despite her vicious kicking and screaming. He unzipped the bag and turned it completely upside down, dumping the contents onto the cold, hard concrete. 4 tightly rolled canvases tumbled out and rolled across the porch, coming to a stop near my expensive heels. They were the extremely rare original oil paintings that had hung in Desmond's private pastoral study for decades. They were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they legally belonged to the corporate estate that I now fully controlled. Vivica let out a horrifying shriek as the expensive canvases hit the ground and partially unrolled. The wealthy neighbors gasped and started whispering to each other, pointing fingers at the disgraced pastor's wife, who had just been caught stealing like a desperate common thief. I looked down at the priceless art and then back up at my mother. I told her that she was absolutely pathetic for thinking she could smuggle stolen corporate assets out of my house right under my nose. I informed her that I would be adding felony theft to the long list of charges currently destroying her ruined family. Desmond came rushing out the front doors just in time to see his wife completely humiliated and the stolen paintings scattered across the concrete. The sight of his final hidden assets being confiscated completely broke whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left in his mind. His face turned a dangerous, violent shade of purple, and the thick veins in his neck bulged as he let out a guttural, animalistic roar. He completely lost his mind right there on the front porch. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was a demon sent from hell to destroy God's chosen prophet. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying, desperate speed. He raised a heavy clenched fist high into the air, aiming a violent, desperate strike directly at my face, intending to punish the daughter who had stripped him of his fake holy empire. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. Before Desmond could even bring his fist down, Elijah moved with lethal professional precision. My head of security stepped smoothly into the path of the strike and grabbed my father's arm mid-swing, stopping the attack instantly. Elijah twisted Desmond's wrist, forcing the older man completely off balance and driving a heavy, powerful shoulder directly into my father's chest. Desmond let out a loud, breathless wheeze as his feet completely left the ground. Elijah tackled him hard, driving the disgraced pastor face first into the concrete driveway with a sickening, heavy thud. The entire neighborhood watched in absolute stunned silence as the once mighty and untouchable Desmond was pinned firmly to the ground by a single security guard. Elijah pressed his knee heavy into my father's back and calmly secured his hands with a pair of heavy plastic zip ties, holding him down effortlessly. I looked down at the pathetic squirming man bleeding slightly on the concrete and smiled, knowing that the great purge was finally complete. The police sirens wailed in the distance, rushing toward the gated community to officially arrest my father for assault and trespassing on my corporate property. I watched the squad cars pull up and load Desmond into the back seat, while Vivica sobbed dramatically on the curb, clutching her empty designer bags. I turned around and walked back inside the massive empty mansion, feeling the cold echo of the marble floors beneath my feet. I knew the physical eviction was only one battle in a much larger war. Desmond had spent 30 years building a powerful network of corrupt politicians and sleazy media executives who owed him massive favors. By Monday morning, his remaining loyal cronies launched a vicious, coordinated smear campaign across every major news network and social media platform in the city. They painted a disgusting, fabricated picture of me as a ruthless, greedy homewrecker who had maliciously stolen her father's holy empire. The tabloids ran horrible headlines calling me a vindictive sociopath who threw her own elderly, helpless parents out onto the streets simply to satisfy a childish grudge. They brought corrupt church elders onto morning talk shows to weep and lie about how my actions were destroying the community and dismantling decades of sacred charity work. The media attacks were incredibly aggressive and relentless. Reporters camped outside the gates of the Obsidian Capitol high-rise, shoving microphones in my face every time my security team escorted me to my car. They shouted terrible accusations, demanding to know how I could sleep at night after leaving my own flesh and blood, homeless and destitute. My public relations team begged me to release a carefully worded written statement, denying the claims and outlining my father's extensive criminal history. They wanted me to play the victim and remind the public about the international money laundering and the hitman my brother had hired. But I absolutely refused to play their pathetic defensive games. I told my team that explaining myself to corrupt journalists was a complete waste of breath and that true power never apologizes or asks for public validation. I decided it was time to change the entire narrative with a single, undeniable action. I ordered my executive team to organize a massive live press conference for the following afternoon. I specifically instructed them to hold the event right on the front lawn of the sprawling seized estate that Desmond had once called his personal holy palace. Dozens of news vans and hundreds of reporters swarmed the manicured lawns of the mansion the next day. The air was thick with tension and greedy anticipation as I walked out the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped up to the polished wooden podium. The reporters immediately began shouting aggressively, trying to trap me with hostile questions about my supposed cruelty and my ruthless corporate takeover. I did not raise my hands to quiet them or show a single ounce of intimidation. I simply stood there looking out over the sea of flashing cameras, wearing a sharp white tailored suit that perfectly reflected my absolute calm authority. I waited until the aggressive shouting completely died down and the journalists realized I was not going to react to their manufactured outrage. I looked directly into the primary television cameras and began to speak with cold, undeniable precision. I did not waste a single second defending my character or arguing with their pathetic tabloid lies. I told the silent crowd that my father and his corrupt cronies had spent decades using this massive estate as a monument to their own wicked greed while pretending to serve the community. I reached into the inside pocket of my white blazer and pulled out the thick, heavy deed to the sprawling 20-acre property. I held the official legal document up high so every single camera could capture the embossed gold seal. I announced that I was completely liquidating the remaining pastoral assets and signing the entire estate over to a newly formed nonprofit trust. I told the shocked reporters that this massive mansion would no longer be a symbol of stolen wealth and spiritual manipulation. I declared that effective immediately, the entire property was being permanently transformed into a state-of-the-art technology and business incubator designed exclusively to fund and educate underprivileged Black women. The absolute stunned silence that washed over the crowd of journalists was deeply, incredibly satisfying. I outlined my comprehensive multi-million-dollar plan, explaining how the massive grand ballroom would be converted into a coding academy and the sprawling luxury suites would become collaborative workspaces for female entrepreneurs. I told them that the millions of dollars Desmond had stolen from vulnerable working-class families would finally be returned to the community to build real generational wealth. I explained that Obsidian Capital would be providing massive, limitless grants to women who had brilliant ideas but lacked the institutional support to bring them to life. I promised that no young Black woman in this city would ever have to beg for a seat at the table again because we were building an entirely new table inside the very house that corruption built. The hostile energy of the press corps vanished instantly. The aggressive reporters who had just been calling me a ruthless villain were suddenly scrambling to ask me about my visionary philanthropic strategies. The narrative completely flipped right before my eyes. By the time the evening news aired, the vicious smear campaign was entirely dead. The media was universally hailing me as a brilliant corporate hero who had boldly dismantled a corrupt religious syndicate to empower marginalized women. Desmond's cronies were permanently silenced, completely unable to argue against a massive charitable initiative that was already changing lives. I sat in my penthouse office that night and watched the news coverage with a profound sense of absolute peace. The Great Purge was finally over and the new legacy belonged entirely to me. The bitter winter wind howled against the cracked window of a cramped one-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town. It was Christmas Eve, and the holiday cheer that illuminated the rest of the city was completely absent from this dark, depressing box. Desmond sat at a wobbly plastic folding table, staring blankly at a plate of cold canned ham and instant mashed potatoes. He looked incredibly old and completely broken. The expensive tailored suits he used to parade around in were gone, replaced by a stained gray sweatsuit that hung loosely off his shrunken frame. Vivica sat across from him, shivering in a moth-eaten sweater, as she swatted a massive cockroach away from the edge of the kitchen counter. The air inside the tiny apartment was thick with the foul smell of stale grease and overwhelming despair. They had spent their entire lives stealing from the vulnerable to fund their lavish lifestyle, and now they were finally experiencing the exact same poverty they had always mocked. The only source of light in the dim room came from a tiny, outdated television sitting on top of a milk crate. The screen glowed brightly, broadcasting the annual end-of-the-year awards gala live from downtown. Desmond dropped his plastic fork as the television anchor cheerfully announced the highly anticipated Person of the Year. The camera panned across a glittering ballroom filled with the most elite and powerful figures in the city before settling on the stage. My face appeared on the screen radiant and completely at peace. I was wearing a stunning floor-length crimson gown that perfectly caught the light as I accepted the prestigious award. The news anchor spoke glowingly about how I had completely revolutionized the city by transforming a massive seized estate into a multi-million-dollar technology incubator for underprivileged Black women. They praised my corporate brilliance and my unmatched philanthropic vision, calling me a beacon of hope and true justice. Desmond let out a choked, pathetic gasp as he watched the massive crowd give me a roaring standing ovation. He watched the powerful politicians and wealthy elite clapping for the daughter he had tried to destroy. His hands shook violently and he squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch the glorious reality of his absolute defeat. Vivica sat frozen, staring at the television screen as tears began to stream down her hollow, sunken cheeks. She watched me smile warmly at the cameras, and the agonizing truth finally crushed what little spirit she had left. She realized that I had not just defeated them, I had completely erased them from my own narrative. I was thriving and building an incredible new legacy while they were rotting in a forgotten corner of the city. The contrast was too much for her fragile, greedy mind to handle. Vivica scrambled off her wobbly chair and frantically dug through her worn purse to find her cracked cell phone. Her hands trembled so badly she dropped the phone twice before finally managing to dial my personal number. She pressed the phone to her ear, sobbing hysterically and gasping for air as the line began to ring. She desperately needed to hear my voice. She needed to know that I still cared enough to listen to her suffer. She wanted to throw one last pathetic guilt trip and manipulate me into feeling sorry for the monsters who had made my life a living nightmare. I was standing outside on the expansive glass balcony of my luxury penthouse, breathing in the crisp, beautiful winter air. The glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out infinitely before me, shining like a sea of diamonds against the dark night sky. The soft, elegant sounds of a live jazz band drifted out from inside my warm penthouse, mixing perfectly with the joyful sounds of the holiday season. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in my hand, feeling completely grounded and remarkably free. I felt my phone vibrate in the pocket of my silk coat. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. I saw Vivica's name flashing across the digital display. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or anxiety. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound calm. I slowly tapped the screen and brought the phone up to my ear without saying a word. The sound of desperate, pathetic sobbing immediately filled the line. Vivica was crying so hard she was choking on her own tears. She wailed into the phone, begging me to listen to her. She cried out that they were completely ruined and starving in a filthy, roach-infested apartment. She sobbed that they had absolutely nothing left to their names, and that the whole world was laughing at them. Her voice cracked as she screamed out her final desperate plea, asking me if I was happy now that I had finally won. She asked me if completely destroying her life and stealing her empire made me feel like a winner. She waited for me to yell or gloat or show any sign of emotional attachment to her suffering. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne and looked out over the glowing city. The wind gently brushed past my face as I spoke into the phone with absolute cold indifference. I told her that I was never competing with her. I told her that I just came to take out the trash. I did not wait to hear her response. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I tapped the screen 2 more times and permanently blocked her number from my life forever. The digital connection was severed, and with it, the very last tether to my dark past was completely destroyed. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took one final look at the beautiful city below. A bright, genuine smile spread across my face as I turned around and walked back through the sliding glass doors into my spectacular penthouse. The room was incredibly warm and filled with the beautiful ringing laughter of the chosen family I had built around me. Elijah and Marcus were by the fireplace sharing stories and laughing with the brilliant young women from my tech incubator. The smell of rich holiday food and fresh pine filled the air. I walked into the center of the room surrounded by people who truly loved and respected me, and I raised my glass to the beautiful, limitless future. The greatest lesson from this story is that true peace arrives when you finally stop seeking validation from toxic people who only drag you down. Blood does not obligate you to endure constant manipulation or emotional abuse. When you realize your true worth, you can stop playing their twisted games and start building your own independent empire. The absolute most powerful revenge is simply living a beautiful, successful life entirely on your own terms. You have the power to cut the heavy ties that bind you to a dark past and surround yourself with a chosen family who genuinely respects you. Bex. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace? Share your brave story with us in the comments below.